And French President Emmanuel Macron has wrapped up a two-day trip to Gabon, the state visit aimed at strengthening and renewing the bilateral partnership 2 years after a coup deposed former leader Ali Bongo, who was in power from 2009 all the way through to 2023. Simon Moritz reports.
Greeted by military parade and clamoring crowds, French President Emmanuel Macron touched down in Gabon on Sunday to shore up diplomatic, military, and economic ties. Unlike several countries in the Sahel which have scaled back or severed their relationships with France in the past several years, Gabon's government has maintained them. Despite the coup that pushed previous head of state Ali Bongo out of power in 2023, the current president, Brice Oligui Nguema, welcomed his French counterpart.
Your presence reflects our shared desire for a new beginning, to build cooperation based on trust, dialogue, and equality with a win-win vision.
Elected last April, the leader has renewed a defense pact with France for 2 years. And Paris has reduced its military presence to 100 troops, down from 1,200 in the 2000s. The soldiers present are currently training Gabonese forces. The Élysée wants to ensure its economic interests as well. Gabon is a country rich in hydrocarbons and manganese, elements that are integral to fuel production, as well as timber. On Monday, Macron underlined the importance of the two countries working together.
August 30th, 2023 was a turning point in Gabon's political history, and you have ushered in a new era based on renewal, inclusiveness, and plurality of opinion, values that our two countries deeply share. That is why France has supported the transition from the very beginning.
And helping to improve infrastructure as well, the French Development Agency is involved in the rehabilitation of the Trans-Gabonais, the country's railway line. A renovation plan launched in 2024 plans to replace the 270 of the 648 kilometers of sleepers and rails by 2027.
The French leader is now in Angola attending a summit of European and African leaders which aims to deepen economic and security ties. Talks with African nations are centring on trade, migration and critical raw materials. Yet the gathering was very much overshadowed by emergency talks on Ukraine being held on the side of the meeting. But as Angola celebrates 50 years of independence, it comes as Brussels says it is committed to resetting its historically tainted relationship with the region. This is what the EU President Ursula von der Leyen had to say earlier.
The global environment has become harsher, but the relationship between Africa and Europe has only grown closer. Global Gateway is not only about large-scale public investment. Its strength lies in governments, banks and businesses from both countries pulling in the same direction.
Joining me now is Paul Melly, an Africa specialist from Chatham House in London. Paul, thank you very much for your time. With China, Turkey and others already very much present in the region, is this a case of Europe leaving it too late in the day in terms of building key trade relationships with African countries?
No, I think it's more a case of updating Europe's relationship with Africa. Europe has traditionally been one of the continent's principal trading partners. And for example, in 2023, it was the largest source of foreign direct investment in Africa with 238 billion euros of investment. So that economic relationship is there. It already exists. It's already quite solid. But as you've said, there's competition from China, from Turkey, from India to a lesser extent now, but perhaps more in the future. You know, these newer actors are coming in and they often offer quite attractive terms. For example, the Chinese are very often willing to build huge infrastructure projects, railway lines, roads, ports, and without some of the financial and political conditions that traditionally Europe has set. So the EU is trying to set forward, as it were, a new, a modernized, refreshed offer of partnership that's different from the old relationship of what was so-called conditionality, where Europe provided aid in return for African countries meeting certain rather specific conditions. It's trying to work with Africa much more, particularly on joint challenges such as tackling climate change.
Is historical baggage not a problem, though? Because it certainly seems to come up time and again when you think of the way that many African people view the relationship, particularly between France and its former colonies.
Yes, historical baggage is always going to be an issue, inevitably, although the colonial era for most African countries, though not curiously for Angola, which didn't get independence till 1975, but for most African countries, independence came around 1960. So the old colonial era is a long way away. Most Africans were born after it had ended, but even so, it still weighs heavily on mindsets and perceptions. And as we can see around all the difficulties that France faced during the very difficult sort of closing phases of its military engagement in the Sahel, it's quite easy in a tense political atmosphere for that old historical baggage still to cause pain. I mean, for example, although there's been an inquiry now into a colonial era massacre in Senegal, and an inquiry that was supported by France, there was quite a lot of delicate negotiation and diplomacy that went on around that. And President Macron has tried through a series, agreeing to a series of historical inquiries into various events around the continent, in Cameroon, in Algeria, of course, in Rwanda from the period of the genocide, to try and shed light and a bit of clarity and honesty about some of these difficult past events. Still, all that history weighs heavily.
I want to come back to what you were just saying earlier, though. African nations are already the primary suppliers of minerals to Beijing. So what exactly can European nations offer by contrast? I mean, can they indeed truly provide a more equitable and sustainable approach to developing natural resources?
Well, I think they're really able to provide two things. One, and it's particularly significant in the present climate, at a time when the US under President Trump has pursued a very unilateralist, transactional approach to international policy. One is to reassert the value of collective action, multilateral action. So, we have the European Union, so 27 member countries. And then we have the African Union with around 50 countries. So these are two groups. By definition, the culture is one of working together. It means that not only the largest countries, but also smaller states have a voice in shaping the agenda. And that really matters, whether you're dealing with economic issues or whether you're dealing, for example, with climate change, as we've just seen at the COP summit in Brazil just a few days ago. So that's something that really matters for Africa, because Africa doesn't have any superpowers, and therefore its voice in the international arena is expressed when it comes together. That's what gives Africa clout. And the same is also true for the EU. And so that's very important. The other thing that the EU can bring is a commitment to tackling some of these issues, such as climate change, but also managing really rather sensitive and difficult issues, of which migration is probably the most difficult and the most painful and controversial, because it's politically difficult for both European countries and African countries. But in working together to find at least easier ways of managing it, or less difficult ways of managing it, that's actually a significant attraction for Africa. And a final point, I think, is that the EU is a very institutional actor. So when it makes agreements and sets the terms of agreements, or African governments negotiate with the EU, or the African Union reaches accords with the EU that set terms, those are things that both sides can then actually count on, because the EU operates through this rather sometimes bureaucratic but predictable institutional structure. And that can be reassuring for international partners.
Paul Melly, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much again. And do stay with us. I'll be back after a short break with more news and headlines. So stay with us here on France 24.